He locked his pregnant wife in a dog shed on the coldest night of the year. And before sunrise, the one man no one in that town dared to face came back to make him regret it. If you have ever known what it feels like to be trapped in a place that calls itself home, this story will hit deeper than you expect. Because this is not just about cruelty. It is about the moment fear meets consequence. Picture a freezing Wisconsin night. Rotting wood, wet straw. A woman 7 months pregnant curled around her unborn child, whispering promises she is no longer sure she can keep. Inside the house, laughter. Outside, silence. Then 3 black SUVs roll through the snow. Stay with me because this story is about pain, power survival, and the kind of love that does not control it saves. Like this video and comment where you're watching from. To understand why those 3 black SUVs mattered, you have to go back 8 years to a small cabin at the edge of Iron Creek where the snow piled high against the windows and every warm thing in the world seemed to fit inside one room. Sadie Bennett was 19 then, quiet by nature, careful with her hands, and almost unnaturally gentle for a girl who had been given so little. Her grandmother, Mabel Bennett, sat by the fire most evenings with a sewing hoop in her lap and a lamp turned low beside her chair. The old woman's fingers were bent with age, but still precise. She could stitch lavender blossoms so fine they looked as if they might release their scent from the cloth. Sadie had learned that same patience from her. Hem by hem, thread by thread. Tiny, beautiful things built slowly, because that was how Mabel believed all worthwhile things were made. Mabel was not Sadie's blood, but blood had never meant much to Sadie. Blood had left her behind. When Sadie was 5 years old, she had been found on the edge of a church parking lot wrapped in a coat that did not belong to her, cheeks blue with cold, too stunned even to cry. Mabel had come by after evening service, seen the little girl sitting by the steps like something the storm had forgotten to carry away, and knelt in front of her without asking a single useless question. "What is your name, honey?" The child had stared at her with hollow green eyes and whispered Sadie. Mabel had nodded as if that answered everything important. "Well, Sadie, you're coming home with me." That was the beginning of her life. By 19, Sadie had become the kind of young woman who moved softly through a room and made it better without drawing attention to herself. She could bake biscuits that stayed tender in the middle split kindling with one clean strike, and repair a winter coat so neatly no one could find the torn seam once she was done. In town, people said she had Mabel's talent with fabric and her own strange way of making you feel calmer just by speaking. They had little money, but poverty felt different when it lived beside dignity. The cabin was old, the floorboards crooked, and the back door swelled in wet weather so badly you had to shove it with your shoulder to get it shut. But the stove stayed hot. The pantry was never empty for long, and every room carried the scent of cedar soap and lavender sachets tucked into drawers with clean linens. In winter, they spent evenings by the fire while the wind dragged itself through the trees outside like something searching for a way in. That life might have stayed small and honest forever if not for the storm. It came down in January with a violence that made the whole town seem temporary. The sky turned the color of iron by late afternoon. Snow began in hard, slanting sheets, then thickened until the woods beyond the cabin disappeared entirely. The radio warned people to stay inside if they valued their lives. Mabel only shook her head and added another log to the stove. "Bad weather never listens to men on the radio," she said. By nightfall, the wind had grown teeth. It rattled the windows. It shoved against the walls. It found every seam in the old place and breathed cold through it. Sadie rose to fetch more firewood when Mabel pressed a hand to her lower back and winced. "Would you mind, sweetheart? My bones are arguing with me tonight." Sadie smiled, pulling on her coat. "I'll be quick." She crossed the yard with one arm up over her face. The shed was only 30 yards from the house, but the storm turned every step into effort. Snow whipped sideways hard enough to sting her skin. The lantern by the porch threw a weak yellow light, then vanished behind the wall of white. She pushed open the woodshed door and bent for the first armful of logs. That was when she heard it. Not the wind, not the trees. A sound too rough and low to be part of the storm. A human sound dragged out of a dying body. Sadie froze. For one long second, fear moved through her so fast it felt like ice water under the skin. Then she turned. A body lay crumpled beyond the corner of the shed, half covered already by the blowing snow. She dropped the logs and ran. The man was face down, broad through the shoulders, heavy enough that she knew at once she would never move him easily. His coat was torn. Blood soaked one sleeve, dark and gleaming. More blood spread from his side, hot enough to steam against the snow. When she rolled him just enough to see his face, she felt her breath catch. He was young, not much older than 28. Dark hair plastered to his forehead, strong jaw gone slack with pain. A face built for arrogance now stripped of everything but survival. His eyes cracked open for half a second. He looked straight at her and tried to reach for something at his waist that was no longer there. Then he blacked out. Sadie should have gone back to the house and barred the door. She should have told herself that a bleeding stranger in a storm only ever meant trouble. She should have remembered all the things poor women in small towns learn to remember. Mabel had warned her more than once about Sheriff Huxley and men like him. The sheriff helped people with last names that carried weight in county offices or bank buildings. Men with polished trucks and broad front porches. Not women in cabins. Not abandoned girls. Not people who fixed other people's hems for grocery money. Sadie looked at the blood, then at the snow burying him by inches, and made the kind of decision that cannot be undone once made. She hooked her hands under his arms and dragged. It took everything she had. Her boots slipped. Her breath burned. Twice she nearly lost hold of him. Once his head lolled back and his eyes opened again, dark and unfocused, and for a strange moment she saw not fear, but fury in them, like some wounded thing still trying to fight the world that had left it in the snow. Then the weight of him sagged again, and she hauled him over the threshold into the shed. By the time Mabel reached them with her cane and lantern, Sadie was on her knees in the straw hands red to the wrists. The old woman held the light high and took in the scene with one look. The wounds, the blood, the stranger. Sadie waiting for permission she had already disobeyed. Mabel set the lantern down. "You've started something now," she said quietly. Sadie swallowed. "I couldn't leave him out there." Mabel gave one small nod. "Then we do it right." Together they worked. Hot water from the kettle, clean cloth torn from old sheets, needle and thread. Whiskey to clean what could be cleaned. Pressure where the blood would not stop. The wound in his side was deep but not mortal if fever did not take him first. The one in his left arm was worse than it looked. The bleeding came hard and steady, and Sadie's fingers began to shake. "I need something stronger," she said. Mabel looked down at the neat handkerchief she had tucked into her apron pocket. White linen, lavender embroidery at the corners, the letter M in pale thread. She pulled it free and handed it over without a word. Sadie wrapped it around the stranger's arm and tied it tight. Blood spread through the lavender petals, almost immediately turning the cloth from delicate to brutal in seconds. But the bleeding slowed, then stopped. The man lived through the night. On the second day, he burned so hot with fever that the air above him felt wrong. He muttered in broken phrases, half orders, half threats, reaching for ghosts in the straw. Sadie fed him water a spoonful at a time. She changed the bandages. She sat beside him with the lantern low and listened to the storm die outside while a different one raged under his skin. On the third night, his eyes opened and stayed open. He looked at the roof first, then the lantern, then her. His voice came out cracked and low. "Where am I?" "In a shed," Sadie said. He turned his head, a little winced, and gave a breath that almost passed for laughter. "Feels about right. You should not move." His gaze sharpened as if pain had pulled him back into himself. He took her in properly then. The plain sweater, the braid over one shoulder, the face lit by lamp glow, the green eyes watching him without fear and without trust. "Who are you?" Sadie dipped a cloth into warm water and touched it to his forehead. "Nobody you need to know." Most men would have pushed. He studied her instead. "You call a sheriff?" "Number." "Why not?" She looked at the bandage wrapped around his arm. "Because you were bleeding to death, and the sheriff takes his time with people like us." That answer seemed to interest him more than anything else. What kind of people are those? The kind who don't matter much to men in uniform. He said nothing after that. His gaze lingered on her face as if he were trying to remember it against her will. The next morning, Mabel carried out a bowl of porridge and set it in Sadie's lap. "You sleep at all?" Sadie shook her head. You need to. I'm fine. Mabel looked at her over the rim of her glasses. That is the first lie a tired woman tells. Sadie smiled faintly. It faded when she glanced back at the stranger. What if he's dangerous? Mabel eased herself down onto an overturned crate and rested both hands on the cane. Most people are in one way or another. That doesn't help. No, Mabel said. But kindness isn't a contract, child. You do it because it is right, not because it comes with guarantees. That night, the stranger woke more fully. His fever had broken. He could sit up with help, though the motion dragged pain across his face. Sadie brought him a cup of water and held it steady while he drank. He kept looking at her. Finally, he said, "You always this calm." "Number. You hide it well." She set the cup aside. "I'm not hiding anything." He let that pass. "Why save me?" She met his eyes. "Because you would have died. What if I deserved it?" The question hung there in the warm dark. Sadie thought of all the things she did not know about him. Who had stabbed him? Why he had been in the woods in a storm? Why a man with hands like his and eyes like that carried violence the way other people carried old grief, close and familiar? Then she said, "A person doesn't stop being a person because they've done bad things. It only means they still have to answer for them if they live." He stared at her for so long she began to wonder if she had said something foolish. At last he asked, "And what if I decide not to answer for anything?" Sadie shrugged slightly. "Then at least you had the chance." Something unreadable moved across his face then. Not softness exactly, more like surprise that had forgotten how to show itself. On the fifth morning, he stood in the doorway of the shed with one hand braced against the frame, looking out at a world gone white and clean after the storm. He had Mabel's handkerchief still tied around his arm, stained now with old brown blood. The lines of pain remained around his mouth, but strength had returned to his posture. Whatever he was not made for weakness. He took a folded stack of cash from inside his coat and held it out. "For the trouble." Sadie did not reach for it. "It wasn't trouble. You sure about that?" "Yes." He lowered the money slowly. "Then tell me your name." She shook her head. He exhaled once through his nose, not quite irritated, not quite amused. "You really planning to send me out into the world owing my life to a woman with no name?" Sadie stepped closer and retied the bandage where it had loosened at the knot. "You don't need my name," she said. "You just need to live." For the first time, his expression changed in a way she could understand. It softened. Only a little, only for a second, but enough to matter. When he walked away through the snow, Mabel stood in the doorway beside Sadie and watched until the dark shape of him disappeared into the trees. Then the old woman said, "There now. Some debts take the long road home." Sadie laughed under her breath. "You always talk like that when you're trying to sound wise." Mabel smiled. "I am wise." Life closed over the incident the way snow covers tracks after wind. Spring came, then summer, then another winter. Sadie married routine again, sewing cooking church on Sundays when the roads allowed it. She thought of the stranger less as time passed until memory filed him down into something that felt almost dreamed. Then Mabel died. There was no warning, no slow decline, no final speech from a bed framed in sunlight. Sadie woke one October morning to a house too quiet and knew something was wrong before her feet hit the floor. Mabel lay on her side beneath the quilt she had pieced by hand 20 years earlier. Her face was peaceful. One palm rested open on the blanket as if she had simply gone to sleep waiting for morning and changed her mind. Sadie touched her shoulder. "Grandma?" No answer. She shook harder, then harder still. The world did not stop. That was the first cruelty. Birds moved outside the window. Water boiled dry in the kettle. A truck passed on the road beyond the trees. Somewhere a dog barked. Sadie sat on the bed beside the body and felt the room split cleanly into before and after. At the funeral, half the town came, because Mabel had hemmed their daughters' dresses, mended their curtains, sat with them through illness, sent over casseroles after losses. No one knew how to name aloud. They spoke well of her in that simple country way that sounds plain, until you realize plainness can hold more love than poetry. Sadie heard almost none of it. When the last car drove away and the cemetery went quiet, she stood alone beside the fresh dirt with a bouquet of lavender in numb hands and understood what real loneliness sounded like. It sounded like leaves scraping over dry ground. It sounded like a house where no one would answer back. It sounded like your own key in the lock when nobody was waiting on the other side. She kept the cabin for almost a year, tried to live in it, tried to keep the stove lit and the curtains washed and Mabel's sewing basket exactly where it had always sat. But grief had a way of turning even comfort into an accusation. Every chair was a shape of absence. Every room was too full of memory to breathe in for long. So she rented a small storefront in Iron Creek and turned it into an alteration shop. The sign outside read, Bennett Alterations in plain blue letters. The inside held one sewing machine, one cutting table, a rack of repaired coats, and a jar of peppermints she kept near the register because Mabel used to say every place of business should have one unnecessary kindness in it. It was there in late December with snow slurring softly at the windows and a radio humming Christmas songs too quietly to matter that Dylan Cross first walked in. He carried an old wool jacket over one shoulder and smiled in the practiced way of men who know their faces are useful to them. Afternoon, he said. Sadie looked up from the hem she was pinning. Can I help you? He laid the jacket on the counter. Ripped lining. My mother says it belonged to my father, and if I ruin it, she'll bury me in the backyard. Sadie smiled despite herself. That sounds serious. It is. She owns a shovel and no mercy. He was handsome in the easy local way. Broad smile, good teeth, rough workman's hands, a voice warm enough to make a room feel smaller. Sadie named the price. He did not argue. He came back 2 days later to pick it up and brought coffee from the diner across the street. Figured you looked cold in here, he said. That was how it began. Not with danger, not with force. With attention. He came by after work, asked about her day, remembered details, brought flowers that were never expensive enough to feel performative, spoke softly when he learned about Mabel. I know what it is to lose family, he said one evening while snow turned the street white outside the shop window. My old man died when I was a kid. House hasn't been right since. Sadie looked down at the dress she was hemming. I'm sorry. He leaned one shoulder against the doorway to the back room and watched her with apparent tenderness. You shouldn't have to do all this alone. That sentence entered her life like warmth under a door. He courted her for 6 months. Sundays at the diner, walks by the frozen river, flowers every Friday. He listened without interrupting. He never touched her without asking in those early days. He made loneliness feel temporary. That was the gift he offered. Not love exactly. Relief. When he proposed, it was on her porch under a pale summer moon with crickets in the grass and the smell of cut hay on the air. He dropped to one knee in a gesture so earnest it disarmed her before she could think clearly. Marry me, Sadie. You'll never be alone again. She said yes because grief had left a hollow in her and his voice fit too neatly inside it. For the first 3 months, married life looked enough like happiness to keep hope alive. Dylan kissed her forehead in the morning, carried in groceries, told people in town his wife was the best seamstress in the county. When he laughed, it filled the kitchen. When he touched her, he knew how to be gentle. Then the changes came one by one, too small at first to name. He began handling the money because he said 1 account is easier than 2. He told her the shop took too much out of her and she could just as easily sew from home. He came home from work angry more often, complaining about men who had less skill and more luck, complaining about bosses who were out to get him, complaining about people who disrespected him. Then he lost his job at the garage. The drinking started as an excuse. Then it became weather in the house. His mother, Marlene, arrived with 2 suitcases and a mouth full of poison. She had the bitter, hard face of a woman who had once been broken by a cruel man and decided never to forgive softness for failing to save her. At first, Marlene insulted Sadie with a smile. You fold towels like an orphan, she said once, as if there were a proper family method for towels, and Sadie had shamefully missed it. Other days, she was more direct. My son married beneath him. Least you can do is act grateful. Sadie tried politeness, silence, endurance. None of it improved anything. Marlene wanted submission, not peace. The first time Dylan hit her, it was over burned rice. One minute he was standing at the stove with a whiskey bottle still in his hand, staring into the pot as if a little char on the bottom were a betrayal. The next, his palm cracked across her face so hard she saw white. She hit the floor on one knee, hand flying to her cheek. For a second, he looked almost shocked at himself. Then anger covered it. Look what you made me do. Marlene stood in the doorway and said nothing. Her silence had approval in it. An hour later, Dylan cried, brought ice and a dish towel, swore it would never happen again. Sadie believed him because not believing him would have required understanding what her life had become. By the time she found out she was pregnant, apologies had become part of the weather too. They came after broken plates, after bruises hidden by sleeves, after nights when Dylan gripped her arm too hard because she answered too slowly. "Baby, I'm trying. You know how pressure gets to me. You have to stop pushing me. I love you. Why do you make everything a fight?" He learned how to blame her with tenderness. That skill was more dangerous than his fists. When her belly began to show, his suspicion took root. "You sure it's mine?" She stared at him stunned. "What?" He swigged from the bottle and looked away. "Don't act offended. Women get lonely." The accusation was so filthy, so absurd, that for one reckless moment she laughed. His face changed. He grabbed her wrist, squeezed until pain shot up her arm, and dragged her outside into sleet and dark. The dog shed was small, damp, and stinking of old straw. Scout, an aging mutt, too tired to bark much anymore, lifted his head from the corner and watched with dull, worried eyes. Dylan shoved her inside. "If you want to act like a bitch, sleep with the dog." He chained the door from the outside. That was the first night. It was not the last. After that, the shed became punishment for anything and everything. Looking too long. Speaking too firmly. Existing in ways that reminded him she still had a self. She would sit in the dark with Scout pressed against her shins and listen to the muffled sounds of the house while her own home denied her entry. In town, people noticed pieces: a bruise near the hairline, a stiff way of moving after a bad night, the fact that she stopped making eye contact, that she no longer lingered after errands, that she answered every question with "I'm fine" in a voice that begged people not to ask another. Most obeyed that plea because comfort is often just cowardice wearing nicer clothes. Only Dr. Naomi Pierce at a small women's clinic 2 towns over looked straight through it. Sadie reached Naomi by accident one afternoon when Dylan passed out drunk and Marlene went to visit a cousin. She borrowed the truck, drove with shaking hands, and sat in the waiting room convinced every passing minute would get her caught. Naomi was in her 50s, silver hair pinned back, white coat open over navy scrubs. Expression. Calm in the way of women who have seen too much and stayed kind anyway. During the exam, she said very little. She measured the baby, checked blood pressure, noted the bruises without flinching. When she finished, she pulled her stool close and asked in a voice so gentle it made Sadie want to cry immediately. "Does anyone hurt you at home?" Sadie looked at the paper crinkling under her hands and said nothing. Naomi nodded once as if silence itself answered. "When I was 30, she said I sat in a room a lot like this and lied for a man who was breaking me apart. So let me save us both some time. You do not have to convince me." Tears spilled before Sadie could stop them. Naomi handed her tissues and waited. No rushing, no pity, no false promises, just presence. When Sadie finally left, Naomi had given her prenatal vitamins hidden in a paper bag beneath old magazines, a card with a phone number written on the back, and one sentence she repeated all the way home like a prayer. "If you decide to leave, you do not have to do it alone. But leaving is hardest before the first step. Hardest when you are hungry, watched pregnant, and told every day that your fear is proof you cannot survive without the very man causing it." So Sadie stayed. Not because she was weak, because she was cornered. Far from Iron Creek in a black glass office high above Chicago, the man whose life she had once saved moved through a world built on money, loyalty, and controlled violence. Nico Moretti had taken the raw brutality of his early years and refined it into power. Men waited outside his office for permission to speak. Politicians pretended not to know his name while accepting favors from men who did. He wore tailored coats now, traveled with security, owned buildings he never entered and bars he never drank in. Yet for 8 years he had kept one old handkerchief in the top drawer of his desk like a relic from a life that should have been buried long ago. When business became unbearable, he sometimes took it out and looked at the faded lavender stitching beneath old bloodstains and thought of a girl in lamplight saying, "You just need to live." He had tried to find her before, paid private investigators, chased dead ends through Wisconsin and Minnesota. But memory is a poor witness, and gratitude has to work with whatever evidence time leaves behind. Then, new restoration methods stripped enough dried blood from the cloth to expose the embroidery more clearly. The letter M, the lavender pattern, the regional stitching style. A seamstress named Mabel Bennett in Iron Creek, Wisconsin. Deceased. One surviving granddaughter by adoption. Sadie Bennett. Married name, Cross. Nico read the file in silence. Then he reached the line about Dylan Cross. Prior complaint involving assault against a former girlfriend. No conviction. Complaint withdrawn. The paper tightened in his hand. He called Jace Rowan in. Jace had been with him long enough to recognize danger by what Nico did not say. "Go to Iron Creek," Nico said. "Watch the house. Watch the husband. Tell me everything." Jace left that night. The reports began to come in. Day 1. Sadie carrying laundry in freezing weather while Dylan drank inside. Day 3. Bruises visible on left forearm. Day 5. Hostile verbal confrontation witnessed by neighbors. Day 7. Lights off in the house past midnight. Subject locked outside in rear animal structure. Jace called at 12:14 in the morning. Nico answered on the first ring. "What is it?" On the other end, wind hissed across the line. Jace's voice was flat, but anger sat just beneath it. He chained his pregnant wife in a dog shed. Nico rose so fast his chair rolled back into the wall. For one hard second, he said nothing at all. Then he slid Mabel's handkerchief into the inside pocket of his coat, looked out over the city, and gave the only order that mattered. "Get the cars." By the time the 3 black SUVs rolled through the gate at the Cross property, the snow had crusted hard over the yard and the whole place looked as if winter itself had judged it and turned away. Sadie heard the engines before she understood what they were. At first, she thought it was the wind shifting again through the trees. Then came the deeper sound, steady and mechanical tires crushing frozen gravel in a slow, deliberate rhythm. Scout lifted his head at once. His old body went rigid beside her. A low growl gathered in his chest. Inside the farmhouse, a chair scraped sharply across the floor. Dylan's voice, suddenly not drunk enough to sound fearless, came muffled through the wall. "Who is out there?" Marlene answered with the tension that cut through her usual venom. "I do not know. Go look." Sadie pulled her coat tighter around herself and curled one arm over her stomach. The baby had been quiet for the last hour, save for the occasional small turn beneath her ribs. She closed her eyes and whispered a prayer she had not meant to pray. "Please let them pass by." But the engines stopped. Doors opened, boots hit snow. Scout moved in front of her, old and thin and absurdly brave. Then she heard a man's voice outside the house. Deep. Calm. Not loud, but carrying with the kind of certainty that made other men lower their own voices in response. Dylan barked something back angry because anger was the only shield he knew. The stranger replied, and though Sadie could not make out every word through the wind, she heard enough. "I am looking for a woman." Her heart hit hard against her ribs. She did not know who would come looking for her. She had nobody. Nobody who knew where she was. Nobody who had ever promised to return. Another voice moved around the side of the property. Another pair of footsteps. Then a flashlight beam cut suddenly through the crack in the shed door, a blade of white in the dark. Sadie flinched, throwing up a hand. Scout snarled. For one instant, the light held on her face, on the wet straw, on her swollen belly, on the chain visible through the broken slat near the latch. Then it disappeared. A few seconds later, a different set of footsteps came toward the shed. Not hurried, not uncertain, heavy enough to be felt through the floorboards. Sadie stopped breathing. The shadow that filled the narrow seam of the door was broader than Dylan's, taller, too. A silence settled outside, the kind that comes when everyone present knows something irreversible is about to happen. Then a voice low and edged like winter steel said, "Open it." Metal clicked. The chain dropped. The door jerked outward with a cry of old hinges, and freezing air flooded in around a man standing in the snow. Behind him, 2 others held flashlights, but he did not need the light to command the moment. He stood as if the cold belonged to him. Dark wool coat, black gloves, snow melting on his shoulders. A scar ran down the length of his left forearm where his coat sleeve had shifted back. Sadie could not see his face clearly at first because the porch light behind him cast him in shadow. She only saw a height stillness and a danger so controlled it felt worse than rage. Scout kept growling. The man looked at the dog, then at her. His gaze did not skim or glance. It landed fully and took in everything. Her bare hands, the bruises at her wrist, the mud on her skirt, the way she folded around her child before anything else. He went very still. Sadie found her voice in a torn whisper. "Please, I do not have any money." The men behind him exchanged a look. The one nearest the door cursed under his breath and turned his face away for a second like he needed it. But the man in front stepped into the shed and bent down until he was closer to her level. "No one here is going to hurt you," he said. Something in his voice made her look up properly. The years had changed him. Time had carved his face into harder lines. The dark hair was shorter now, brushed back from a broad brow. His jaw was rough with the shadow of beard, his mouth unsmiling, but the eyes were the same, dark and watchful and strangely alive, even in stillness. Her breath caught, not because she knew him yet, because some buried part of her had known before her mind did. Behind him, Dylan's fear boiled over into fury. "She is my wife," he shouted, stumbling through the yard. "You cannot take what is mine." The man in front of Sadie did not even turn his head. One of the others moved fast as a striking snake and caught Dylan by the chest before he could reach the doorway. Dylan swung wild. The other man hit him once in the stomach and shoved him backward into the snow. Marlene screamed from the porch, "Call Sheriff Huxley. Call him right now. These people are criminals." The tall man's attention never left Sadie. "What is your name?" he asked. The question startled her. Dylan never asked questions unless they had a wrong answer waiting inside them. "Sadie," she said at last. He repeated it quietly, as if placing it against an old memory to see if it fit. "Sadie." Then his eyes moved to Scout, who still stood between them, trembling and growling. The man held out one gloved hand for the dog to smell. Scout hesitated, gave a warning rumble, then let the hand come near enough. The man did not pet him. He only let him decide. After a moment, Scout stepped back and pressed against Sadie's knee. The man looked at her again. "I am going to ask you one thing, and I need the truth." His voice remained even. "Do you want to stay here?" She stared at him. The question seemed impossible, like being asked whether she wanted air while drowning. For 2 years, her life had been a long corridor of demands, accusations, punishments, and apologies shaped like traps. Want had become a dangerous word. Desire belonged to other people. Her mouth opened, but no sound came. From the yard, Dylan started shouting again, his voice cracking. "Sadie, tell them to leave. Tell them you are fine." "Fine." She looked past the man kneeling before her and saw the outline of the house, the porch where Marlene stood, the doorway where Owen hovered in the background, pale and useless, the yard where Dylan was dragging himself to his feet with murder in his eyes and snow on his mouth. Then she looked down at her belly, at the child turning softly inside her, oblivious to all but the body carrying her. When Sadie finally spoke, the words shook, but they did not break. "I want to go." For the first time that night, something moved in the man's face. Not relief exactly, something deeper and sharper. He stood at once and offered her his hand. Sadie stared at it. No one had offered instead of taken in so long that the gesture itself felt foreign. "You do not have to stand alone," he said. Very slowly she put her hand in his. His grip was firm, warm, even through the glove, and careful with her as he helped her rise. Her legs trembled violently from cold, and hours curled on the shed floor. He steadied her without pulling her close. He left space for her to decide her own balance. Dylan lunged again the second she crossed the threshold. "You ungrateful little bitch." This time the dark-haired man beside her turned. He did not raise his voice. He did not look enraged. He looked far worse than enraged. "You locked a pregnant woman in a dog shed," he said. Dylan spat blood into the snow. "That is my wife, my family, my business." The man stepped between Dylan and Sadie with such final authority, the yard itself seemed to rearrange around him. "No," he said, "not anymore." One of his men held Dylan down by the shoulder. Another had already moved to the porch, where Marlene stood raging and helpless, her threats growing smaller by the second as she realized nobody here was listening to them. Sadie swayed. The man beside her looked down immediately. "Can you walk?" "I think so." "Good. We are leaving." Scout whined and trotted after them. Sadie managed 2 steps before she stopped and turned. The dog. The man followed her gaze, then gave a brief nod to the one restraining Dylan. "Bring him." It was the simplest thing anyone had said for her all year, and it nearly undid her. They led her to the middle SUV. The interior smelled faintly of leather and clean wool. Heat wrapped around her the second the door closed, and for one awful instant she could not breathe because warmth felt too much like safety, and safety felt too much like something she no longer trusted. The man sat across from her once the vehicle started moving. Another drove. Scout lay curled at her feet after one suspicious look around the back seat. Streetlights from the edge of town flickered across the man's face in long, passing bars of gold and shadow. Sadie studied him between one breath and the next, and with every mile some old image pushed higher in her memory. Straw under lantern light, blood on white cloth, a stranger asking her name in a shed. He watched her watching him. "You know me," he said. "I knew someone once," she answered faintly, "a long time ago." His hand went inside his coat and came back with a folded square of cloth. When he set it in her lap, the whole world narrowed to one object: white linen aged and softened by time. Lavender embroidery at the edges. The letter M stitched in pale thread. Brown stains where blood had once soaked so deeply it changed the fabric forever. Sadie touched it with shaking fingers. Mabel's handkerchief. The man looked at her in the dim, moving light. You tied it around my arm. Now she saw it all, not in fragments, entirely. The blizzard, the blood, the fever, the dark eyes watching her from straw, the scar. She lifted her gaze to his face, then to the arm beneath his coat where the line of old damage showed faintly through the fabric. You are him, he nodded once. Nico Moretti. The name meant nothing at first. Then it did. Even in Iron Creek, where people pretended big city things stayed in big cities. She had heard it muttered once or twice in the diner when truckers talked too freely after midnight. A man from Chicago. Powerful. Untouchable. The kind of man sheriffs and senators denied knowing while taking care not to cross him. Sadie felt a chill move through her despite the heat. He saw it. I know what people say, he said. Most of it is true. She looked down at the handkerchief again. Why did you come? I spent 8 years looking for the woman who saved my life. Her throat tightened. I only changed your bandages. You gave me a reason to keep breathing. His voice remained quiet, but something lived under it now. That was not a small thing. She had no answer to that. The roads widened as they left Iron Creek behind. Snow blurred past the dark windows. Madison lay nearly 2 hours south, but time inside the vehicle moved strangely, pulled between exhaustion and shock. Sadie finally asked the question, lodged like glass under her ribs. How did you know about Dylan? Nico's jaw hardened. I found your married name. Then I found his record. Then I sent someone to watch the house. You were watching us. I was watching him. The distinction should not have mattered. Somehow it did. She leaned back against the seat and closed her eyes for a moment. The baby shifted once, then settled. Scout's breathing rose and fell against her boots. Across from her, Nico said nothing more, as if he understood silence was the only mercy left to give. By the time they reached the private hospital wing in Madison, Sadie was shaking again. Not from cold now, from the force of abrupt change. Men in dark coats moved efficiently around her, holding doors, clearing hallways, never touching her unless she asked for an arm. A nurse in navy scrubs led them into a room larger than any place Sadie had slept in since childhood. White sheets, soft light, clean air. She stopped in the doorway. Nico noticed at once. What is it? She looked at the bed and heard herself say with a kind of horror she could not hide. I do not know how to sleep in something that clean. The nurse's face changed, not professionally, humanly. You do not have to worry about that tonight, she said gently. Just come sit down. A doctor arrived less than 20 minutes later. Silver hair pinned back, clear, tired eyes, quiet hands. Dr. Naomi Pierce. The second Sadie saw her, something inside her that had been locked down for months gave way. Naomi crossed the room quickly and took both her hands. Oh, sweetheart, she said. I have got you. The exam took nearly an hour. Blood pressure dangerously high. Bruises old and new. Severe stress. Exhaustion. Signs of malnutrition. The baby's heartbeat, though, came through the monitor strong and stubborn, filling the room with a rapid living rhythm that made Sadie cry so hard she had to turn her face into the pillow. Naomi stayed with her. When it was over, she sat on the edge of the bed and brushed damp hair from Sadie's forehead exactly as Mabel once had. You did the hardest part, she said. You left. Sadie stared at the blanket gathered in her fists. He found me. I did not leave. Naomi's expression did not change. When he asked if you wanted to go, you said yes. That counts. Outside the room in the dim corridor, Nico stood with one hand braced against the wall beneath the narrow window in the door. Jace waited a few feet away, arms folded, face drawn tight with a rage he had not bothered to hide since Iron Creek. How bad, he asked. Nico kept his eyes on the room beyond the glass, on Sadie, small against the white bed, on Naomi, speaking to her in the careful tones reserved for the deeply injured. Bad enough. Jace let out a breath through his nose. Say the word and Dylan Cross disappears before morning. Nico's face went still. For a long moment he looked like the man Chicago feared. The man who had climbed out of blood and poverty and betrayal by learning to be colder than the men who tried to bury him. Then he said, not tonight. Later, when the nurses had brought broth and dry clothes and Naomi had stepped out to make calls, Nico knocked once on the open door before entering. Sadie was sitting upright now, wrapped in a pale blue hospital robe, Mabel's handkerchief folded beside her on the tray table. Her face was colorless with fatigue, but the wild terror he had first seen in the shed had eased enough for something steadier to show through. He stayed near the foot of the bed. "You should be sleeping," he said. She gave the faintest shadow of a smile. "I have not caught up with the fact that I am here." He understood that better than she knew. "You are safe here." Her eyes lifted to his, clear green even with exhaustion dragging at them. "Are you safe?" The question startled him enough that he almost answered honestly before he remembered how to protect himself. "Number." She seemed to consider that. "You came anyway?" "Yes." A quiet stretched between them. Then Sadie said, "Why keep the handkerchief all these years?" Nico looked at the folded cloth, then at the scar on his arm, as though both belonged to someone else for a second. "Because that night was the first time anyone did something for me without wanting a piece in return. No money, no name, no leverage." He met her gaze. I had never seen that before. Sadie lowered her eyes. "Mabel would say you must have known very bad people." "I did." The room fell silent again. The sounds of the hospital moved faintly beyond the walls. Distant cartwheels, a monitor beeping down the hall, someone laughing softly at a nurse's station. Sadie touched the edge of the blanket. "There is something you need to know," she said. Nico waited. She lifted her chin with visible effort. "I am grateful to you. More than I can say. But I cannot go from one man deciding everything for me to another. I cannot survive that." He did not speak immediately. The honesty in her face demanded more from him than easy reassurances. At last he said, "Tell me what you want." Her breath caught slightly, as if she had not expected the question to come back to her. "A lawyer," she said. "A divorce. I want my daughter somewhere he cannot reach, and I do not want choices made around me like I am not in the room." Nico inclined his head once. All right. You will have a lawyer, the best one in Madison. You will have security, a place to stay, medical care, whatever you ask for." He paused. "And nothing you do not ask for." That last sentence sat between them with unusual weight. Sadie studied him for so long he wondered what she was seeing. A man who owed a debt. A criminal in an expensive coat. A ghost from a blizzard. Maybe all of it. Then she nodded. "Thank you." He moved to leave, but her voice stopped him. "Nico." He turned. "When you asked me in the shed if I wanted to stay or go." She swallowed. "No one has asked me what I wanted in a very long time." Something in his chest tightened hard enough to feel like injury. He answered in the only way that did not betray too much. They should have. When he stepped back into the hallway, Jace looked at his face once and said nothing. That night snow fell again over Madison, soft and constant beyond the hospital windows. Inside room 814, Sadie Bennett lay awake with one hand over her child and Mabel's handkerchief resting beneath her pillow, while outside her door the hallway lights burned late and steady. By morning the hospital had settled into that fragile quiet only possible in places where pain and hope share the same walls. Snow clung to the window ledges outside Sadie's room in pale ridges, turning the city beyond into something soft and distant. Inside, the heat hummed low through the vents. A nurse had brought tea she did not drink and toast she could only manage half of. Scout slept near the armchair, chin on his paws, one ear twitching every time footsteps passed in the hallway. The baby moved now and then beneath Sadie's hand, a reminder that even inside safety her body had not yet learned how to unclench. She had slept in fragments, 10 minutes at a time. 20, maybe. Every creak in the corridor dragged her half awake. Every change in light made her think of doors opening, chains rattling, a voice slurring her name with anger in it. At some point after dawn, Naomi returned with fresh scrubs under her coat and a folder tucked beneath one arm. She closed the door quietly behind her and smiled the way doctors do when they know gentleness is more useful than cheer. "How are we doing this morning?" Sadie looked down at the cup in her hands. "I feel tired enough to sleep for a year and too nervous to close my eyes." Naomi nodded as if that made perfect medical sense. "That sounds about right." She checked blood pressure first. Lower than the night before, but not yet where she wanted it. Then the baby. Strong heartbeat. Good movement, no immediate signs of distress. "You bought yourself and this little girl a chance. Naomi said, setting the stethoscope aside. That matters. Sadie let the words sit in the room without trying to answer them. She still did not know what to do with praise that did not come sharpened by criticism. Naomi opened the folder. A lawyer will be here this afternoon if you still want one. Sadie gave a small nod. I do. And security remains outside the room. Nico arranged private coverage in addition to hospital staff. Naomi's mouth curved faintly. He has a very particular way of worrying. That brought Sadie's eyes up. He stayed. He has not gone far. Sadie looked toward the door, though she could not see through it. Last night, in the blur between exhaustion and disbelief, Nico Moretti had felt almost unreal. Something half memory, half consequence. In daylight, he seemed more dangerous, somehow not less. The dark coat had been replaced by a charcoal suit that fit him too well to be anything but custom. The scar on his arm was only visible when he moved a certain way, but once seen it was hard to ignore. Men like Dylan moved through the world in blunt force. Men like Nico looked as if force had learned how to dress itself. And yet, when he had asked what she wanted, his voice had gone quiet enough to leave room for her answer. Naomi finished making notes and rested a hand lightly on the bed rail. I need to ask something difficult. Are you willing to give a statement while the bruises are still fresh and the details are clear? Sadie's stomach tightened. To the police. To your lawyer first, then to the proper people if you choose. City police, not Sheriff Huxley. He has no authority here. No authority here. The phrase carried more relief than it should have. I can try, Sadie said. Naomi squeezed the rail once and headed for the door. Before leaving, she paused. You do not have to be brave all at once, Sadie. You only have to be honest. When the room was quiet again, Sadie leaned back against the pillow and stared at the ceiling. Honesty was simple when spoken in private. Harder when paperwork touched it. Harder when a woman had to say out loud every small humiliation she had spent months pretending not to feel. He slapped me over burned rice. He locked me outside in winter. He sold my grandmother's necklace. He made me apologize after he hurt me. He called fear love until I almost forgot the difference. A knock came at the door not long after. Soft. Once. Sadie turned her head. Nico stepped inside, carrying a paper bag from somewhere outside the hospital, steam curling from the top where it had not fully closed. He did not enter as if the room belonged to him. He entered as if he understood it did not. I asked downstairs what pregnant women are supposed to eat after a night like that, he said. The woman at the cafe told me I looked like a man who would not take no for an answer and gave me oatmeal fruit and something called a decent muffin. Sadie looked at the bag, then at him, and before she could stop herself, a small laugh escaped. The sound seemed to catch him off guard. He set the food on the tray table. I take that as a good sign. It is the first time anyone has brought me breakfast without using it to apologize. His face changed only slightly, but enough for the room to feel different. He pulled the chair nearer to the bed, though still not too near, and sat. You spoke with Naomi. She said a lawyer is coming. Yes. Sadie picked at the edge of the blanket. And the police. If you want them involved, city detectives can take a statement here. If you do not, that is your call. His gaze stayed on her face. Nothing happens without your say. There it was again, the thing she still did not know how to trust. No one had ever returned power to her in pieces before. Usually men took it in handfuls and called the theft marriage duty concern protection. She glanced at him. You keep saying that. Because I mean it. Do men like you usually mean things? One dark brow lifted. No. The honesty in that answer unsettled her less than a lie would have. For a while they sat in a silence that did not demand filling. Nico seemed comfortable in silence. Not awkward with it, not eager to conquer it. Just able to stay inside it without making a woman feel responsible for his ease. Then Sadie said, When you left that shed 8 years ago, I thought I would never see you again. Nico rested one forearm on his knee. I thought I was walking away from the only decent thing I had ever been given. You make it sound dramatic. It was dramatic. I was stabbed twice and half dead in a snowstorm. A second laugh slipped from her before she could stop it. It hurt in the best way, the way stretching hurts after too long curled up small. His expression shifted, not into a smile exactly, but close enough to warm the edges. Then the warmth vanished. Voices carried from the corridor. Male, sharp, loud enough that even Scout's head came up. Sadie stiffened. Nico stood in the same motion. The voices grew clearer. One protesting, one commanding. Then a crash of something metal hitting a wall. Sadie's blood went cold before she recognized Dylan's voice. Get out of my way. That is my wife. The room seemed to shrink all at once. Her hand flew to her belly. Nico turned to her. "Stay here." She could not answer. He was already at the door when it swung open and Jace stepped in, face cut from stone. He is in the lobby with Huxley. For 1 second, Nico did not move. The stillness was worse than anger. Then he looked at Sadie. "I will handle it." Dylan's shouting echoed up the corridor as Nico and Jace disappeared. Scout gave a low, anxious whine. Sadie slid her feet to the floor before she realized she was moving. Her pulse beat in her ears so hard it blurred the edges of sound. "Stay here," Nico had said. But the old instinct to track danger, to know where it stood and how close it was, had already taken hold. By the time she reached the doorway, 2 nurses were hurrying past toward the elevator banks. A security guard spoke quickly into a radio. The polished hallway seemed unnaturally bright. Sadie moved into the corridor with one hand braced under her belly. At the far end near the waiting area, she saw them. Dylan looked as if he had been dragged through 3 bad nights and a whiskey bottle. His jaw was unshaven, his eyes bloodshot. A bruise darkened one side of his face where Jace had put him down in the snow. Beside him stood Sheriff Dale Huxley in full uniform, all cheap authority and small-town swagger, though even from a distance, Sadie could see the sweat at his temples. Madison was not his territory. The badge on his chest looked too light for the confidence he was trying to wear. Nico stood opposite them, hands at his sides, Jace a step behind and to the left. Dylan saw Sadie first. "There she is," he shouted. "Sadie, tell them I came to bring you home." Every muscle in her body locked. Nico turned sharply at the sound of Dylan's voice and spotted her in the hallway. For a moment his expression flashed with something close to frustration, but he did not speak it aloud. Huxley squared his shoulders. "Mrs. Cross, this has been made to sound uglier than it is. Domestic disagreements get exaggerated when city people get involved." The familiar poison of that voice slid through her nerves like old sickness. Nico's head turned very slowly toward him. "If you speak to her again like that," he said, each word precise and lethal, "you will regret discovering how far your badge does not reach." Huxley's mouth tightened. "You think you scare me?" "Yes." No one in the lobby moved. Dylan took a step forward and switched tactics so fast it made Sadie's skin crawl. "Baby," he said, and put hurt in his voice like he was putting on a coat. "I was worried sick. I woke up and you were gone. They took you in the middle of the night like criminals." Sadie stared at him. He had used that tone before. Soft pleading, injured. It always came after something ugly. It always asked her to comfort the man who caused the wound. "I locked you out because I was angry," he said quickly. "I know that was wrong. I know it. But we can fix this. Come home and we can fix this." Her heartbeat slowed, not because she was calmer, because a strange clarity had opened beneath the fear. Maybe it was the clean hospital air. Maybe it was Naomi's quiet certainty. Maybe it was the fact that Dylan, standing under bright lights with strangers watching, looked smaller than the version of him that had filled her nightmares. For the first time in 2 years, she saw him without the walls of his house around him. He was not enormous. He was not inevitable. He was just a cruel man with bad habits and a loud voice. Sadie took 1 step forward. Nico shifted as if to stop her, then stopped himself. "Dylan," she said. Her own voice sounded unfamiliar to her, not stronger, clearer. His face brightened instantly. "That is right. Come here, sweetheart." "You locked me in a dog shed." The words landed in the room with a force greater than shouting. Dylan blinked. "I said I was sorry." "You hit me while I was carrying your child." His jaw twitched. "You know how you get under my skin." "You sold my grandmother's necklace for liquor money." "That is not what happened." "It is exactly what happened." Huxley tried to step in with the oily tone men use when trying to smooth over violence they have chosen not to name. "Folks, this kind of thing belongs in a family meeting, not a hospital lobby." Sadie turned her head and looked at him so directly he faltered. "You saw the bruise on my face outside Miller's grocery 3 months ago," she said. "You saw it and walked away." Color drained from his cheeks. Dylan's softness cracked. "Do not embarrass me in front of these people." Something almost like astonishment moved through Sadie then. All this fear, all this pain, and still his deepest concern was embarrassment. "I am not coming back," she said. He laughed once, short and ugly. "You think this man is going to save you?" The entire lobby seemed to hold its breath. Sadie did not look at Nico when she answered. "I do not need him to save me. I need you to leave me alone." Dylan's face changed completely. Rage rushed in where charm had failed. You belong to me. Nico moved, then not fast, but with such absolute intention that every uniformed person in the lobby took a step back without meaning to. He came to stand beside Sadie, not in front of her, and that small placement mattered enough that she felt it in her chest. No, he said. She does not. Huxley lifted his chin with a show of courage too thin to hold. You have no legal claim here, Moretti. Nico turned his gaze on him, and the sheriff lost half his posture in an instant. You brought an abuser across county lines to intimidate a hospitalized pregnant woman, Nico said. You did that in a building with cameras on every wall. Think carefully before you mention the law to me again. A hospital administrator appeared from the corridor with 2 city officers behind him. The administrator's smile was tight and official. You gentlemen need to leave now. Dylan pointed at Sadie, shaking. This is my wife. One of the officers glanced at Sadie. Ma'am, do you want this man removed? Everything in her life seemed to narrow to that one question. Do you want? Again. And again the answer came from someplace deeper than fear. Yes, she said. The officers moved at once. Dylan fought, swore, shouted her name with all the old fury back in it, but it sounded different here. Smaller, trapped by clean walls and witnesses. As they hauled him toward the elevator, he twisted hard enough to look over one shoulder at her. This is not over. The words should have struck like thunder. Instead, they hit like weather already moving away. Huxley lingered 1 second too long, then followed pale and sweating. When the lobby finally settled, Sadie realized her hands were shaking so badly she could not unclench them. Nico turned to her at once. Sit down. I am fine. You are white as the wall. She tried to answer and could not. Pain knifed suddenly across her lower abdomen, fierce and sharp enough to steal the breath from her lungs. Her knees buckled. Nico caught her before she hit the floor, one arm at her back, one beneath her elbow. Careful and controlled even in urgency. Naomi was there almost instantly, as if she had run from the far side of the building. What happened? Contraction. Sadie gasped. Naomi looked down. A dark wetness spread across the front of Sadie's gown and dripped onto the polished tile. Oh, Naomi said, very calm. All right. Her water broke. We are having this baby. Everything that followed blurred. A wheelchair. Then a gurney because the contractions came too quickly for sitting. Ceiling lights passing overhead in rapid white squares. Nurses moving with clipped, efficient voices. Someone asking her to breathe. Someone else cutting away the gown and covering her with clean sheets. The smell of antiseptic and warm plastic. A blood pressure cuff tightening around her arm again and again. Pain rose in waves, each one larger than the last, each one stripping something unnecessary away. Between contractions, she saw Nico, once in the doorway, stopped by a nurse in blue scrubs. His face harder than she had ever seen it, and more helpless too. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second before she was wheeled through another set of doors. Labor collapsed time. Minutes became noise and light and pressure. Naomi's voice anchored the room from somewhere near her shoulder. Breathe with me, Sadie. Good. Again. Another nurse wiped her face with a cool cloth. The pain was not like being hurt by someone else. That made it both better and stranger. It was pain with purpose. Pain moving toward something. Still, there were moments when her body felt split open by effort and memory at the same time. Between one contraction and the next, Mabel came back to her in flashes. Mabel at the stove flower on her cheek. Mabel in church off-key and unashamed. Mabel's hands guiding hers through tiny lavender stitches. Mabel saying, "Come on, honey, you live with me now." Sadie clung to that voice when the pain peaked high enough to turn the room white at the edges. "I cannot," she said once, half sob, half breath. Naomi's face came close, steady and unshaken. "Yes, you can. You already are." Outside the delivery room, Nico wore a path into the floor. Jace leaned against the wall nearby, arms folded, watching his boss with the wary fascination of a man who had seen him step over bodies without pausing and was now watching him come undone in silence because of one closed door. "You should sit," Jace said eventually. Nico did not slow. No. A nurse emerged briefly with forms and stopped dead at the sight of him prowling the corridor. "Sir, you cannot pace in front of the station." Nico stopped immediately. "I apologize." The nurse blinked, accepted the impossible politeness, and hurried away. Jace almost smiled. "You ever looked that nervous before? Number. That is bad." Yes, he was not afraid of blood, or guns, or men. He knew how those stories ended because he had lived inside them. But this was life arriving through pain he could not fight, could not bargain with, could not take on to his own body for her. It made him feel like the 28-year-old man in the blizzard again reduced to helplessness under a force larger than pride. Hours later, just when exhaustion had hollowed everything out, a new sound split the corridor. A baby's cry, thin at first, then strong enough to fill the hall. Nico stopped walking. The entire world narrowed to that sound. A minute later, Naomi stepped through the swinging door's mask hanging loose around her neck, silver hair escaping its pins, eyes tired and bright. "You have a daughter," she said. "Both of them are safe." Nico stood very still, absorbing the sentence as if it were in a language he had once spoken and nearly forgotten. "Can I see her?" Naomi studied him for one brief second and then nodded. "Briefly. And do not bring the storm in with you." Inside the room, everything had changed. The lights were lower now. Machines beeped softly from the corner. Blankets and trays and discarded wrappers made the space look lived in, human, no longer clinical. Sadie lay propped against the bed, hair-damp face, exhausted and radiant in a way Nico would not have believed possible if he had not seen it with his own eyes. In her arms, wrapped in a hospital blanket with pink and blue stripes, was the smallest person he had ever seen. The baby's face was red from crying, her mouth pursed now in sleep, one tiny fist tucked under her chin. Nico moved closer as if approaching something holy. Sadie looked up at him. Her voice was raw but warm. "She is loud." He let out a breath that almost became a laugh. I noticed. For a moment, neither of them said anything. He only looked at the child, at the impossible smallness of her fingers, the dark damp hair at her crown, the rise and fall of a chest no bigger than his palm. Then his eyes lifted to Sadie. "How are you?" "Tired," she admitted. "But I am here." He nodded once because anything more felt dangerous. "What is her name?" Sadie looked down at the baby. Her expression changed into something so soft it hurt to witness. "Mabel," she said. "After my grandmother." Nico lowered his gaze. "That is a good name." Sadie shifted carefully and held the bundle a fraction higher, as though inviting him to see her better. He did not reach out. He did not assume. He only stood close enough to watch. "She is safe," Sadie whispered almost to herself. Nico looked at the child, then at the mother who had fought her way here and answered with all the certainty he possessed. "Yes," he said. "She is." For a little while after Mabel was born, the world narrowed to hospital-light warm blankets and the fragile astonishment of survival. Sadie had expected relief to feel clean and immediate, like a storm ending all at once. Instead, it came in waves, uneven and tender. One moment she would be staring at her daughter's sleeping face with something close to peace in her chest. The next she would hear a man laugh in the hallway, and every muscle in her body would lock before she even understood why. Naomi told her that was normal. Nothing about the word felt large enough for what lived in her nerves, but Sadie let it stand. Mabel spent her first days in the world with the stubbornness of a child who had chosen her moment carefully. Her lungs worked perfectly. Her appetite arrived with force. She cried loudly when changed louder when hungry, and quieted only when pressed against Sadie's skin, or when Scout settled near the bed and let out one low grumble as if appointing himself guardian of the room. Nico came and went with the patience of a man walking into church after a lifetime spent elsewhere. He never arrived empty-handed. Soup from a restaurant downstairs, soft blankets, a tiny knitted cap one of the nurses had convinced him a newborn required immediately. He stood beside the bed and listened when Sadie spoke. He stepped back when she grew tired. He asked before he touched the baby, and when she placed Mabel in his arms for the first time, his face changed so completely that Sadie had to look twice to be sure she was seeing the same man who had walked into a frozen yard like judgment. He held the child like something breakable and dangerous at once. Naomi watched from the doorway and murmured to Sadie, "That man looks like he would shoot his way through a city and apologize to the baby for raising his voice." Sadie surprised herself by smiling. On the third day, the lawyer arrived. His name was Daniel Mercer, mid-40s, trim suit, calm eyes. He carried 2 legal pads, a fountain pen, and the kind of quiet confidence that did not need to announce itself. Nico introduced him in the hospital room, then stepped back toward the window without speaking over anyone. Daniel did not begin with papers. He asked Sadie if she was comfortable, if she wanted water, if she needed the door closed more fully, if she preferred Nico remain in the room or leave. Sadie glanced once toward the window. Nico read the glance correctly. "I can wait outside." She surprised herself again. "No," she said. "You can stay." Daniel nodded once, made no comment on that, and began. The account took nearly 2 hours. Not because Daniel dragged it out, but because truth had a strange way of breaking apart as it left her mouth. She could say Dylan hit me. That was simple. Less simple was saying the first slap came over burned rice because she had been trying to finish a hem after midnight for a customer who paid in cash. Less simple was explaining the exact tone Dylan used when he apologized, how he cried once into her shoulder and swore his father's temper had gotten into him like an inherited illness, how he made her comfort him for hurting her. Daniel wrote everything down. He did not flinch when she described the dog shed. He did not soften his expression when she spoke of Mabel's necklace sold for liquor money, of Dylan's hand around her wrist, of being denied doctor visits, of Sheriff Huxley shrugging off bruises with that small-town phrase everyone used when they wanted to call cowardice respect. Family matter. By the time she finished, Sadie felt emptied out, scraped thin from the inside. Daniel set down his pen. You have more than enough to file for an emergency protective order. Full divorce and sole custody, he said. With the hospital incident, criminal charges are already moving. You do not need to carry this alone anymore. She looked at the pages on his lap, dense with her suffering translated into neat black lines. For 2 years, she said quietly, I thought if I could just be better at keeping peace, he would get tired of being angry. Daniel's expression did not change, but something sharpened in his voice. Men like that do not get tired of anger. They build homes inside it. Silence settled. Then he asked the next necessary question. Will you testify if needed? Sadie's eyes moved to Mabel asleep in the bassinet by the bed, tiny mouth open, one fist by her cheek. Yes, she said. Nico turned his face slightly toward the window, then giving her privacy even while standing only feet away. She understood the gesture for what it was. Respect. He knew the shape of power well enough to recognize when not using it mattered more. City detectives came that evening. Unlike Huxley, they arrived without swagger. One woman, one man, both from Madison. Their questions were clear, their tones professional, and the female detective Laura Kemp had a way of pausing after difficult answers that made room for breath. Sadie gave her statement. Nico remained outside the room at Daniel's request. Jace stayed in the hallway with folded arms and a face that discouraged interruption. By the time the detectives left, there were already enough charges building against Dylan to keep him in county custody until arraignment. That night, Sadie slept more deeply than she had since before the shed. Not peacefully. Peace was still too far away to touch. But deeply enough that when she woke after dawn with her heart racing from some dream she could not fully remember, her first instinct was not terror. It was disorientation. She looked at the clean room, the sleeping child, the old dog by the chair, and slowly remembered where she was. Then she cried, not because anything had gone wrong, because for one fragile moment nothing had. Naomi found her like that and sat on the bed without speaking. When the tears slowed, she handed Sadie a tissue and said, "The body keeps score long after the danger moves rooms." Sadie nodded, though she was not sure she understood entirely. She only knew she still felt Dylan in her bones sometimes, as if his voice had crawled into the spaces between muscle and memory and made a nest there. A week later, after doctors were satisfied both mother and baby were stable, Naomi cleared Sadie for discharge. The idea terrified her. Hospitals had rules, doors witnesses controlled entry points. The world outside had roads and parking lots and shadows that belonged to whoever stepped into them first. Daniel had already arranged temporary housing under court protection in a quiet neighborhood outside Madison. Nico had paid for it. Sadie knew that. She also knew he had done so only after Daniel presented it as a legal necessity and only after she agreed. The house was small, furnished, and anonymous in the way safe places often are. Pale siding, 2 bedrooms, narrow kitchen, curtains that did not quite fit the windows. There were no photographs on the walls and no history in the floorboards. Nothing there had known her when she was afraid. That was both mercy and ache. When they arrived, she stood in the doorway holding Mabel in her arms and did not step inside for a full 30 seconds. Nico waited on the walk behind her, a diaper bag hanging absurdly from one broad hand. "If you hate it," he said, "we find another one." She looked over her shoulder. "You say things like that as if houses grow on trees." He lifted one shoulder. "In my experience, most things grow if you throw enough money at the roots." Despite herself, she laughed. Then she crossed the threshold. Those first weeks were not graceful. Mabel woke every 2 hours, sometimes every 90 minutes. Scout, uncertain about the new place, patrolled the hallway at night as if expecting enemies behind the laundry closet. Sadie moved through the days in a fog of soreness, milk paperwork, and nervous exhaustion. She forgot to eat unless Naomi reminded her. She checked the locks 3 times before bed. Once at noon, when a delivery truck backfired on the street, she dropped a dish in the sink and had to sit on the kitchen floor breathing into her palms while the baby cried in the bassinet. Naomi came often. So did Daniel, though less visibly. Protective orders were issued. Divorce papers filed. Statements exchanged. Court dates assigned. Dylan's attorney, a tired man with a weak chin and eyes already clouded by inevitability, tried for a brief moment to suggest reconciliation or supervised discussion. Daniel shut that down with one phrase. Bring the man who chained a pregnant woman in a dog shed into a courtroom and ask for mercy if you like. I am not advising my client to donate a second of her life to your fantasy. After that, the tone shifted. Owen Cross came into the story again the way guilty men often do, through hesitation. He did not arrive at the house. He was not given the address. He called Daniel first, then Naomi, then finally left a message in a voice so strained it sounded scraped raw. I need to speak to Sadie, just once. If she says no, I understand. Sadie listened to the recording 3 times before deciding. He came to Naomi's office 2 days later, where the waiting room smelled faintly of lemon polish and hand soap. He looked thinner than she remembered. Paler, too. There was a new kind of damage in his face, the kind that comes when a man can no longer hide from his own reflection. When he stepped into the consultation room and saw her with Mabel asleep in a carrier at her feet, he stopped so abruptly it looked almost like prayer. Sadie. She folded her hands in her lap. Owen. He stood for a second longer, then sat only after she gestured toward the chair opposite. I do not know how to start, he said. Try with the truth. The words came out flatter than she intended, but she did not take them back. Owen looked down at his hands. I knew more than I let myself admit. Sadie said nothing. I told myself it was not my business, that if I stepped in, he would kill me or my mother would throw me out or I would make it worse for you somehow. His mouth tightened. Mostly I was a coward. The honesty of it made the room feel very still. When you called the police, Sadie said, why then? He swallowed hard, because he took the gun. She watched his face while he spoke and saw no defense left in it. No excuses dressed as context. Just the ruin of a man who had finally looked directly at his own silence. I am not asking you to forgive me, he said. Good. His eyes lifted, then surprised by the hardness in her tone. Sadie met them steadily. You heard me cry in that shed. He nodded once, miserable. You sat in that house and ate while he hurt me. Another nod. You let your mother speak to me as if I was a stray animal she wished someone would put down. Tears rose in his eyes so quickly it seemed to embarrass him. I know. She thought for a long moment, aware of the quiet weight of Naomi's office around them. The sleeping baby at her feet. The woman she had been and the woman she was trying to become sitting side by side in her own chest. Then she said, if you really know, then tell the court. He looked up. What? Tell them what you saw. All of it. Not the cleaned-up version, not the part that makes you look better. The whole thing. Owen stared at her, then nodded with the slow certainty of someone stepping onto a bridge he had spent years pretending not to see. I will. After he left, Naomi came in with 2 mugs of tea and set one down by Sadie's hand. How do you feel? Sadie watched the steam rise. Angry, she said. Then after a pause, lighter than I expected. That can happen when somebody finally stops lying to protect themselves. The criminal hearing moved faster than the divorce. Hospital footage took care of some of that. So did the weapon recovered from Dylan when he was arrested. But the larger case, the one that stretched back through 2 years of bruises and forced apologies, built itself slowly in affidavits, photographs, medical records, and witness statements. Naomi testified first in deposition, then in court. Her voice never rose. She did not dramatize. She simply laid out facts with the terrible force that facts sometimes have when spoken by someone who knows exactly what she is looking at. Malnutrition in late pregnancy. Repeated contusions at various stages of healing. Elevated blood pressure consistent with chronic stress. Patient self-report corroborated by observed fear response. Daniel called it devastating. Nico called it not enough. During those weeks, he continued to appear at Sadie's rental house with a regularity that would have felt like surveillance from another man. With him, it became something else because he never acted as if a rival entitled him to entry. He knocked, always. If she said it was a bad time, he left. If she looked exhausted, he offered to hold Mabel while she showered or slept 20 minutes on the couch. The first time she handed him the baby and disappeared into the bathroom, she stood under the hot water with her forehead against the tile and cried so quietly she could barely hear herself. Not from grief, from the unbearable shock of being helped without debt collecting in the background. When she stepped back out in clean clothes, hair damp, she found him sitting on the living room rug with Mabel across his bent knees, one large hand supporting the back of her head, while the other rested open on her tiny stomach. He was speaking to her in Italian under his breath, some low, soft thread of language too private to be performance. He looked up when Sadie entered. She frowns like you. She is hungry. That is all newborns do. He considered the baby's face seriously. Then she also judges like you. A smile tugged at Sadie before she could stop it. The first time he offered to buy her a house, it happened exactly the way she had feared such things might happen. Quietly, reasonably, almost kindly enough to be dangerous. He was standing in the kitchen rinsing bottles while she folded laundry at the table. Evening light pooled gold across the floor. Mabel slept in a basket lined with soft blankets Daniel's assistant had sent over. "This place is secure for now," Nico said without looking at her. "But I could put you somewhere permanent. Better neighborhood, better locks, room for the baby, room for you." Sadie's hands stilled on the onesie she was folding. "Nico." He turned off the tap and faced her. "I know. No, I do not think you do." Her voice remained calm, but every word had to be placed carefully. "I need walls I can say I chose. Floors I paid for. A key that is mine because I earned the door it opens." He held her gaze for a long moment. There was no offense in his face, only thought. Then he nodded once. All right, that was all. No wounded pride, no insistence, no speech about wanting what was best for her. Just acceptance. Later, after he had gone, Sadie sat alone in the kitchen with Mabel asleep against her shoulder and realized that what moved her most was not his offer. It was his restraint. The trial opened 1 month after Mabel's birth in a county courthouse just north of Madison. Sadie did not attend the first day. Daniel advised against it. Naomi agreed. The prosecutors had enough to proceed without forcing her into the room while preliminary arguments and motions ground through procedural machinery. So she stayed home, nursed the baby by the window, and watched snowmelt drip from the eaves while the television remained dark. On the second day, Daniel called just after noon. "They are putting Owen on the stand." Sadie sat very still. "Will it matter?" Yes. He did not need to say more. She turned on the local news coverage only once, volume low enough not to wake Mabel. The footage was grainy too wide, catching mostly courthouse steps and reporters in dark coats. Dylan appeared only briefly between deputies, wrists cuffed, expression bloated with rage. Even through a screen, he radiated the old contagion of his need to own the room he entered. Sadie turned the television off before he vanished through the doors. She could not breathe well for a minute after. That evening, Daniel came by in person. He found her at the kitchen table, Mabel drowsing in her lap, Scout sprawled under the chair. "Owen told the truth," he said. She looked up. "How much of it?" "All of it." Daniel sat down across from her and loosened his tie with 2 fingers. He testified to the beatings, the shed, the verbal abuse, your mother-in-law's participation, Huxley ignoring visible injuries. He paused. He also said silence made him an accomplice. Sadie stared at the table grain. Outside, somewhere down the block, a car door slammed and laughter drifted briefly through the dark. Normal life, other people's ordinary evenings. How did Dylan react? Daniel gave a tired breath. Like a man discovering consequence as eyewitnesses. The sentence was dry enough that it almost sounded gentle. 3 days later, the verdict came. Sadie did not go to court for that either. She stood in the narrow living room with Mabel against her shoulder, while Nico, Naomi, Daniel, and Jace all occupied the house in different corners as if unconsciously bracing the walls with their bodies. Nobody spoke while the court clerk read from the screen on the local station. Guilty on aggravated domestic abuse. Guilty on unlawful restraint. Guilty on armed criminal threats. Additional sentencing enhancement based on conduct toward a pregnant spouse. When the judge pronounced prison time, Dylan rose half out of his chair and shouted something the microphones did not fully catch, but everyone in the room understood enough. Threat, fury, ownership refusing death even while chained. The judge's voice cut across his. Let the record reflect, the defendant continues to issue threats in open court. The feed ended minutes later. Nobody in Sadie's house moved for a while. Then Naomi stepped close and touched her elbow. Well, she said quietly, there it is. Sadie looked down at her daughter's sleeping face. A strange emptiness opened in her chest. Not joy, not triumph, nothing so clean. Just space. The kind of space left after something enormous had finally been dragged out of the room. 1 week later, the divorce hearing concluded with less theater and more paperwork than suffering deserved. Sadie attended that one. She wore a navy dress Naomi helped her choose, and the plain silver earrings Mabel used to wear on Sundays. Daniel sat beside her. Nico remained in the back row because the court allowed it, and because he understood precisely where not to stand. Dylan appeared by video from county detention. He looked diminished on a screen, all his menace flattened by bad lighting and institutional walls. Still dangerous, still angry, but no longer able to fill the air around her. When the judge asked whether she wished to resume her maiden name, Sadie did not hesitate. Yes, she said, Sadie Bennett. The words landed in her own chest like a key turning. Later outside the courthouse, Daniel shook her hand and told her the paperwork would be finalized by end of day. Naomi hugged her. Jace stood guard by the curb, pretending not to be guard at all. Nico opened the back door of the car and waited while she buckled Mabel into her seat. Then he asked where to. Sadie looked through the windshield at the late afternoon light washing over Madison in pale gold. Home, she said. And for the first time in years, the word did not feel borrowed. The first months of freedom did not arrive dressed like freedom. They arrived as paperwork exhaustion and quiet mornings that still made Sadie flinch when the house settled too loudly. Some days she woke with milk on her shirt, a baby crying in the next room, and a pulse already running hard before her feet touched the floor. Other days she stood at the sink rinsing bottles while sunlight filled the kitchen and felt something so close to peace that it frightened her more than panic ever had. Healing asked stranger things of her than survival had. Survival had been simple in its brutality. Stay quiet. Read the mood in a man's footsteps. Hide what mattered. Make yourself smaller. Wait for the weather inside the house to change. Healing required the opposite. It asked her to take up room in her own life, to speak when silence still felt safer, to believe that a locked door could simply be a locked door and not a warning, to let kindness touch her without reaching for the price hidden behind it. Naomi told her often that the body learned fear through repetition and had to learn safety the same way. So Sadie practiced. She practiced sleeping with the bedroom window cracked open so winter air no longer felt like punishment. She practiced leaving one dish in the sink overnight and discovering the world did not end because a task remained unfinished. She practiced saying no when she meant no. She practiced asking for help before exhaustion turned her hands clumsy. Mabel helped in the way babies sometimes do by being too immediate to leave space for old ghosts all day long. She demanded feedings, dry blankets, a song, warmth, movement, eye contact. She would not wait for her mother's fear to finish speaking. She wanted the world now and loudly. Her tiny face had begun to round with health. Her dark hair came in thicker every week. Her fists opened into searching hands that reached for light fabric Scout's ears, the edge of Sadie's sleeve, and once, with solemn concentration, the scar on Nico's forearm. Scout adapted to the new rhythm with the dignity of an old soldier called back into service. He slept near the crib at night and near the front door by day. He inspected every grocery bag Nico carried and every repairman Daniel sent over, every package Naomi dropped off with practical notes written across the top in neat slanted handwriting. He had decided this was his family now, and old age had not dulled his sense of duty. When spring finally loosened winter's grip on Madison, Sadie moved again. Not because the safe house had failed her. It had done exactly what it was meant to do. It had held her between danger and the life she had not yet built. But she wanted walls that carried her choices. So with Daniel's help, and only Daniel's help when it came to paperwork, she found a modest 2-bedroom house in a quieter town west of the city. It had a narrow porch, a postage stamp yard peeling white paint around the back window, and a maple tree that dropped red leaves in great untidy piles every fall. The kitchen was small enough that one person cooking filled it completely. The living room held afternoon light like a bowl holds water. There was a second bedroom that could be both nursery and workspace until one day it needed to become only one thing. Sadie signed the lease with a hand that trembled only once. Then she stood in the empty living room with Mabel balanced on one hip and whispered the address out loud, just to hear herself belong somewhere on purpose. She bought used furniture and scrubbed it clean herself. She hung simple curtains in pale cream. She placed Mabel's crib near the window where morning light came first. She set her sewing machine by the living room wall and arranged thread scissors, chalk, and measuring tape in a basket Mabel could not yet reach. The first night they slept there, the house made unfamiliar noises, as all houses do. Pipes ticking, wind brushing the siding, Scout shifting his weight at the bedroom door. Sadie lay awake for nearly an hour listening. Then Mabel gave one sleepy sigh from the crib, and Sadie realized no other sound in the room held anger. She slept. Work began as necessity and became structure. At first, it was the kind of mending women do for each other when word starts to spread quietly that someone's hands are good and her prices are fair. Hem a pair of school pants. Replace a zipper in a winter coat. Take in a church dress after too much grief or too little money has changed a woman's shape. Sadie took every job she could from the little sewing corner in her living room while Mabel napped in a basket lined with soft blankets nearby. She worked during feeds and between feeds while Scout snored and sunlight crossed the floorboards while Naomi dropped in with casseroles and disapproving looks if Sadie had skipped lunch while Daniel stopped by with legal updates that grew less urgent with each passing month. Sometimes Nico appeared in the doorway with groceries or toy blocks, or simply his own quiet company, and if she was measuring a sleeve or pinning a hem, he sat where he would not be in the way and held the baby with astonishing patience. Summer widened her days. The house warmed. The maple tree filled with green. Mabel learned to laugh before she learned to crawl, and once she discovered laughter, she used it recklessly as if joy were a thing you could spend without running out. Sadie found herself laughing too. Not all the time, not even most days, but often enough that the sound stopped startling her. Therapy helped. She kept going. The first months, Naomi handled the doctor part of her healing. A counselor named Evelyn handled the rest. Evelyn had kind eyes, sturdy shoes, and a room lined with books nobody seemed required to understand before speaking. In the early sessions, Sadie cried more than she talked. Then she talked more than she cried. Eventually, she reached the harder territory where tears and words had to coexist. She spoke about guilt, about how leaving late can feel like failure even when leaving at all took everything. She spoke about shame, how abuse made ordinary needs feel embarrassing, how even now she apologized when someone handed her a glass of water. She spoke about anger, which was harder than fear, because anger required admitting someone had taken what had been hers. Evelyn listened and said things that did not try to fix her too quickly. What happened to you was built over time. Of course your body learned it slowly. Of course trust feels expensive. Of course freedom feels unfamiliar. You have not been living with it very long. One afternoon in late July, Sadie was hemming a bridesmaid dress while Mabel rolled on a quilt at her feet, and Scout slept by the door when a young woman stepped into the house with a denim jacket buttoned all the way up despite the heat. She could not have been more than 23. She carried a paper bag in both hands and held herself like someone trying not to take up air. There was makeup under one eye applied too carefully to be cosmetic rather than camouflage. Her mouth was tight with the effort of appearing ordinary. Sadie recognized the posture before she recognized anything else. Fear had a way of changing the body. It made women fold inward even while standing. "Can I help you?" Sadie asked. The woman set the paper bag on the small work table. "I heard you do alterations." "I do." "It is just a skirt," the woman said. "Nothing complicated." Sadie unfolded the garment. It was not torn. The zipper was fine. The hem was untouched. The woman's hands were shaking. Mabel babbled on the quilt. Scout lifted his head, glanced once at the newcomer, and rested it again. Sadie looked back at the woman and saw it then. The bruise under the makeup. The way she kept glancing toward the window. The stiffness in one shoulder as if it had been grabbed too hard too often. There were moments in life when directness could feel like danger, and this was one of them. So Sadie did not ask the question living just behind her teeth. She only said tea is on the stove if you need to sit down first. The woman stared at her. Something in her face broke open so suddenly it was almost painful to witness. I do not have anywhere to go for an hour, she whispered. Sadie set the skirt aside. Then sit for an hour. That was how it began. Not as a plan, not as a mission, not as a declaration. As one room opened by another woman who remembered exactly how long 60 minutes could be when you needed a safe place to exist inside your own skin. Her house became that place more than once. Then enough times that Naomi suggested carefully and without pressure that if Sadie wanted to formalize help, there were local organizations that could connect women with housing attorneys, child care, and jobs. Daniel said he would handle any paperwork she did not understand. Evelyn asked whether building something from the wound would feel empowering or too close to the wound itself. Sadie thought about it for weeks. Then she rented a storefront. It was smaller than the place she once had in Iron Creek, and brighter by miles. Sun came through the front windows all morning. The back room held a sink, a tiny office, and space enough for a fold-out cot if a woman needed rest more than pride. The sign over the glass door went up in early autumn. Mabel's Stitches. She stood across the street holding her daughter and read the painted letters 3 times before going inside. The shop smelled of new paint, fresh wood, and fabric bolts stacked against one wall in soft towers of color. A local carpenter Naomi knew had built fitting mirrors and a cutting table at cost. Daniel sent flowers that looked too expensive for the room. Jace installed better locks without being asked and pretended he had only been passing through town. Nico came after closing with a vintage Singer machine refurbished to perfect working order, then looked almost annoyed with himself for how pleased he seemed when Sadie ran her hand over the black iron body and laughed in delight. You found this where? She asked. A man in Milwaukee owed me a favor. That seems ominous for a sewing machine. Most of my stories do. She looked at him across the small glowing shop, twilight blue at the windows and lamplight warm inside, and thought how strange it was that danger in one man had felt like imprisonment, while danger in another had become restraint. Nico still carried the world he came from in every movement. Men still answered his phone calls too quickly. Cars still waited when he parked. He was not softened into harmlessness. That was never who he was. But with her, he had learned a different language. He knocked. He asked. He waited. And because he waited, she slowly ceased needing to run. Business grew by degrees. Alterations first. Then custom dresses. Then christening gowns. Prom hem suit repairs. Memory quilts made from old shirts after funerals. Women brought clothes and stayed to talk. Some came because Naomi had given them the name. Some because Daniel knew legal aid volunteers. Some because word traveled the way important things still travel in smaller places from one careful conversation to the next. If someone needed a place to sit, there was tea in the back. If someone needed a phone, there was a private line. If someone needed an attorney, Sadie had numbers written in a drawer under the till. If someone needed work, there was hemming, pressing, hand finishing, and eventually payroll modest enough to start but steady enough to matter. By winter, 3 women besides Sadie were sewing at tables in the front room on certain afternoons, while Mabel, now sturdy enough to cruise along furniture, treated the entire shop like her kingdom. Scout slept by the register as if guarding the receipts. Sunlight moved across faces, no longer trying to disappear, and the soft mechanical hum of machines became its own kind of anthem. Nico never tried to make the shop his project. He knew better. When he offered support, it came quietly and mostly through other people. A donation from an anonymous foundation Daniel somehow knew how to direct. A contractor who did not charge for plumbing repairs after a pipe froze. Better exterior lighting installed overnight with no invoice left behind. Sadie saw his hand in all of it and said nothing until one evening after closing when the snow outside turned the world beyond the windows silver and still. She was balancing the books at the front counter. Nico sat on the floor nearby while Mabel climbed over his legs and tried to steal his watch. You know, Sadie said without looking up, anonymous generosity is less anonymous when it arrives wearing your fingerprints. He glanced up. Do I have fingerprints on plumbing now? You have fingerprints on everything. That sounds like an accusation. It is a warning. He smiled, then slow and rare. The sight of it still caught her off guard. Nico's smile did not erase the hard life in his face. It lit it from somewhere underneath, revealing the man who might have existed if nobody had ever taught him cruelty was the safest way to stay alive. As months passed, trust gathered between them in ordinary ways. He learned how Sadie took coffee and that she preferred silence in the first 10 minutes of morning. She learned that he slept little and badly, though worse when he had not seen her for too many days in a row. He learned to change diapers with military precision and no pride about the task. She learned he spoke to Mabel in Italian when he thought no one was listening, as if giving the baby a language he trusted before he trusted the world around her. He learned which stories about Chicago she did not want to hear. She learned where to place a hand on his shoulder when old ghosts from his side of life followed him to her door in the form of exhaustion he refused to name. The first time he stayed for dinner happened on a Tuesday in late October. Rain pressed softly at the windows. The shop had closed early because one of the women helping in the back had a court date the next morning and could not thread a needle for shaking. Sadie had sent her home with soup and instructions to come back only after sleeping. Mabel had mashed sweet potatoes into her own hair and laughed so hard at the mess that Scout abandoned the room in offended dignity. By the time the baby was bathed and asleep, the house had settled around the kind of quiet that invited honesty. Sadie and Nico sat on the porch steps under the weak yellow porch light, each holding a mug gone slowly cold. Wet leaves shone in the yard. Somewhere farther down the street, a screen door banged, and then all was still again. For a long time, neither spoke. Then Sadie set her mug beside her and reached across the step between them. Her fingers touched the back of his hand, first lightly, as if testing whether the moment would hold. Nico went motionless. She turned his hand over and threaded her fingers through his. The scar on his forearm looked pale under the porch light. "I have been thinking about you," she said. His voice, when it came, was lower than usual. "That is dangerous for both of us. I know." He turned his head, then watching her with a focus that made the night seem to narrow around them. Sadie took a breath. "When you first came back, I only knew what you had done for me. Then I knew what you were capable of. Then I learned who you become when you choose not to force anything." She held his gaze. "That is what stayed with me." Nico said nothing, but his hand tightened once around hers. "I do not know how to do this quickly," she admitted. "You do not have to. I do not know how to be easy. I am not asking you to be." A smile touched her mouth. "That might be the first good thing anyone has ever said to me about love." Something moved in his face at the word, not triumph, not possession, only tenderness sharpened by caution. Sadie leaned in first. The kiss was brief and gentle, and entirely hers to begin. Nico did not chase it deeper. He met her there and waited, letting her decide its shape and length, and whether there would be another. When she drew back, his forehead nearly touched hers. "Are you all right?" he asked. The question went through her more cleanly than the kiss had. Nobody had ever stopped in the middle of wanting her to make sure she still belonged to herself. "Yes," she said softly, "I am." A week later, he returned with a small velvet box in his coat pocket. Sadie knew by the look on his face that it mattered before he even set it on the kitchen table. Mabel was in her high chair banging a spoon. Scout lay under the window in a square of winter sun. The whole room smelled of cinnamon because Sadie had spent the morning testing a coffee cake recipe Naomi swore was foolproof and had nearly proved otherwise. Nico pushed the box toward her. She opened it. For a second, she could not make the world around the object in the lining connect to the room around her. Mabel Bennett's silver lavender pendant lay inside on its chain, cleaned but unmistakable. The small engraved leaves. The tiny stone at the center. The clasp, Mabel always complained, was too fine for old fingers. Sadie's hand flew to her mouth. "Nico." He watched her quietly. How she whispered. "I had people look. Pawn records, estate dealers, private sales." He lifted one shoulder. It moved around more than it should have. Tears filled her eyes so fast she had to blink against them. "I thought it was gone forever." "I know." He came around the table then and stood behind her chair. Not crowding, not claiming. Just near enough that when she tilted her face up toward him through tears, he could see how much of the past lived in that small silver thing. "This is not a debt," he said. She swallowed. "What is it then?" His hand brushed the back of her neck, warm and careful, as he lifted the chain from the box. "It is love." He fastened it around her neck with fingers steadier than her own. When the pendant settled against her skin, Sadie bowed her head and cried. not with the hopelessness of the dog shed, not with the numbness of the courthouse. This was grief and gratitude braided so tightly together that neither could be separated from the other. Mabel came back to her in that touch of silver against her chest. Mabel at the stove. Mabel at church. Mabel handing over the handkerchief without a word because some acts of mercy did not need speeches. Nico bent and kissed the crown of her head. He did not say anything else. Nothing else would have survived the moment. Near the end of autumn, when the air had sharpened and the maple leaves lay rust-red across the grass, Sadie drove back to Iron Creek for the first time. Not alone. Mabel rode in her car seat, kicking one small shoe against the cushion and babbling at passing clouds. Scout slept in the back. Nico followed in another car and kept his distance the whole drive, close enough to matter far enough not to intrude on the private ache of return. The cemetery sat just beyond town, where wind moved through dry grass and the headstones faced the open sky without complaint. Sadie carried a bouquet of lavender wrapped in brown paper. Mabel, bundled against the cold, rested on her hip. Mabel Bennett's grave was simple. Name, dates, a small carved spray of flowers along the bottom edge. Sadie knelt in the grass, laid the bouquet down, and brushed dead leaves from the stone with her bare hand. For a while she did not speak. She only stood inside the silence and let the years touch each other. Then she said, "I found my way." Her voice came out thinner than she expected. "I thought I had lost everything you gave me. I did not." Mabel clutched a fistful of Sadie's scarf and made a soft, questioning sound. Sadie smiled through tears and shifted her daughter higher on her hip. "This is your namesake," she whispered to the grave. "She is loud and stubborn and already thinks the world should answer when she talks." Behind her, at a respectful distance, Nico stood by the wrought iron fence with his hands in his coat pockets, and his gaze turned partly away, offering privacy without abandoning presence. That, too, had become its own language between them. Sadie touched the pendant at her throat. "I am not afraid all the time anymore," she said. "I thought you should know." The wind moved gently through the cemetery grass. Mabel babbled once at the stone, and then laughed at nothing visible as babies often do. Sadie laughed too, half broken and half healed, which perhaps was the truest way to be alive. By the time winter returned in full, Mabel's stitches had become more than a shop and less than an institution, which was exactly how Sadie wanted it. She did not need grand language. She needed real doors, real wages, real numbers to call when a woman whispered she could not go home tonight. On a bright December morning, the first hard snow of the season lay in clean banks along the street. Sunlight poured through the front windows so strongly the bolts of fabric seemed almost lit from within. 2 women were working at the cutting table. Another stood at the pressing station humming to herself under her breath. Scout snored by the register. Coffee brewed in the back room. Mabel, now toddling more than crawling, moved from chair to chair with the determined concentration of the newly upright. Sadie sat at her machine finishing the cuff on a winter coat when the bell over the door rang. Cold air brushed in first, then Nico. Snow dusted the shoulders of his dark coat. He closed the door behind him and stamped once on the mat before Mabel spotted him and let out a delighted sound that brought every head in the room up at once. Nico's whole face changed. He bent and scooped the child into his arms just as she launched herself toward him without caution or dignity. She grabbed a fistful of his lapel and pressed her cheek against his jaw as though this had been her plan all morning. One of the women at the cutting table smiled into her work. Sadie looked up from the machine and watched them. The tall, dangerous man in the good coat. The little girl with winter-red cheeks. The old dog by the register. The women sewing in warm light. The pendant resting against her collarbone. The life humming around her, built not in a blaze but in stitches, one careful seam after another. Nico looked across the room and found her eyes. He did not need to say anything, neither did she. Her smile rose slowly then completely, and for once there was nothing behind it that needed hiding.